Welcome to another edition of Grace Under Pressure, where my guest today is Phil Klay. I'll tell you all about Phil in just a moment. Grace Under Pressure is that show that deals with what's often called the soft stuff, the caring, the commitment we exert toward others. And when you do it, when you're as a leader, as you'll very much discover that Phil is, you do it to bring people together for common cause. Phil Klay, welcome to Grace Under Pressure.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great. I want to tell folks all about you. Phil Klay is a veteran of the U.S. Marine Corps, served in Iraq. His short story collection, which was my first introduction to his work, was called Redeployment, and won the National Book Award for 2014, as well as other books. And it was a 10 best at New York Times. His nonfiction book, and that's why we're here now, has won the George H.W. S.J. Prize for journalism. And his work has appeared in the big publications everywhere: New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Atlantic, and The New Yorker. His novel, the first novel, was released in October of 2020, and President Obama called it one of the best books he had read that year. So again, very high praise. The book we're going to talk about today is called Uncertain Ground, which is a collection of essays. And it was recently reviewed by James Fallows in the New York Times Book Review. So welcome, Phil Klay.
Thank you.
Great. So jump in with the essays. I want to focus on your nonfiction work because that's what we do in this show, or because I'm not qualified to talk about fiction.
Everyone is qualified to talk about fiction.
In the opening essay of your new book, Uneven Ground, you write that people want to talk, because you are a Marine veteran, served in Iraq, always want to talk to you about combat. You tell a different story about being in a hospital. That gives us a different perspective. Tell us why you chose to do that, Phil.
Sure. So I was a staff officer, right? So I was not kicking down doors or doing anything especially dangerous or exciting. But I was in Anbar province in 2007 during the surge. It was a fascinating time to be there. And part of my unit was we had the doctors, right? So the medical staff. And it was a level 2 facility. So if somebody comes straight off the battlefield, they do what they can to stabilize them, sort of life, limb, and eyesight preservation. And then they'd send them on to the next level of care. And so we treated Marines, obviously, but also sometimes civilians, and on some occasions, enemy fighters. And there was this one time when a Marine came in. He'd been shot by an enemy sniper, and the doctors did everything they could to save him, and he died, right? Which is a pretty crushing experience, as you can imagine, for the medical staff. But they didn't really have time to think about that, because they immediately got word that the enemy who had shot and killed this Marine was en route. And so they prepared to care for him, right? As, one is required to do. They stabilized him. They succeeded in saving his life. And then one of the nurses was that insurgent's flight nurse. And he was just, he later talked to me about, being on this helicopter out to the next level of care, checking this guy, making sure that he made it to the next level in a moment of sort of, not necessarily quiet, because the helicopters aren't noisy, but in a sort of set aside moment of reflection. And I just thought about that image of him caring for this guy. And
a guy who had shot his colleague or his fellow Marine. So,
right, who'd shot a Marine, fellow service member. And just what that image expresses about military values, and who we are and who we say we are, versus some of the more sort of grotesque images that came out of the war, right? And I think I pair that with Abu Ghraib and the story of a friend of mine who was an interrogator there. And one of the reasons that I wanted to dwell on that is because I think that, when people talk about the military and war, they tend to think of it in sort of very direct, like tactical successes or failures, right? And they don't often think about the sort of values that you want to instill and uphold as a member of the military. And you know, he's talking about something a little bit different, but Clausewitz always talks about how the moral forces in war are those that are determinate. And so the particular sort of ethic of your organization, the virtues that you expect people to uphold, has a huge amount to do with how people feel about serving in that organization, right? And also about how you're perceived. Now, the fact that Americans treated prisoners well, or were thought to treat prisoners well, meant that Iraqi soldiers in the initial invasion were more willing to surrender, right? And not fight to the death, which meant less loss of life, right? After Abu Ghraib, the fact that Americans had developed a reputation for torture and savagery inspired people to fight us. It stopped people from wanting to work with us, and it led to a lot more dead Marines. And I also think that there's a sort of internal thing that happens among the people who serve, and how they see themselves and how they see the sort of justice of the mission that they're a part of when you fall away from the sorts of virtues that you profess. And so that's what that story is, one that I tell in an essay, kind of reflecting on that.
It's a powerful essay, and it gets to the heart of the themes that you cover so often. And one of the themes, and I've had other veterans on this show talk, and special forces folks, and the word love comes in. Yes. And it's a theme that I've noticed in fiction, your fiction, as well as this. So what does love in combat mean? It almost seems like the antithesis of what we as civilians would assume. So,
you know, this is a point that the Marine combat veteran Elliot Ackerman makes, right? He talks about seeing a Marine shot in the middle of the highway, and then another Marine going out to get him, and that Marine getting shot. And what happens? Another Marine goes out to get that guy. And, you know, the way Elliot put it to me, he said, like, I've never felt brave. Like, courage is not a feeling, right? So you don't rush out under fire to grab your fellow Marine because you're feeling brave, right? You do it because you love them. And the sort of perverse aspect of war is that training develops these intense bonds between men and women, where they feel deeply connected to each other, and then they go into a place where, you know, those men and women are at risk.
Right. You mentioned Elliot Ackerman because I read one of his pieces, and he talked about a sense of purpose and being in combat. And you echo the same thing, that had never felt more alive. And we've heard that before, but at this deep sense of purpose. And you write in your book that when you left the Marines, you created the sense of community. You would frankly risk your lives for one another. And you said, and you write so eloquently, I want to quote this: I was deprived of that community and not fully absorbed into the civilian world. I was alienated, as so many veterans are. And this strikes me as like what Elliot Ackerman was writing about, is search for purpose. Am I correct in that, Phil? So,
absolutely. I think that, you know, sometimes when veterans have difficult experiences adjusting to the civilian world, the assumption is that it's because of negative things that they experience in the military, right? Trauma or whatever. Yeah. But I think that it's also important to note that, and this is a point Sebastian Junger has made as well, that there's a lot of positive things, right, about life in the military, that these sort of feeling intensely bonded to the people around you, feeling a sense of trust in them, feeling a sense of broader purpose and mission. And of course, war makes you feel as though what you're doing is extremely important because the stakes are life and death. That can be in some ways intoxicating. No, I think that civilian life is equally valuable and equally important, right?
Sure.
But life in the military, it sort of feels obviously so, right? And there's a kind of intensity and starkness to that because there are people fighting and dying and killing.
Right. Yeah. And to carry on this love theme, I believe that was introduced to you, or at least you expressed it in one of your essays about your experience at, was it Quantico or an officer's candidate
Quantico,
school?
yes.
And one of the, a sergeant said something to you about love. What was
Tough
that?
love in the Marine Corps. Only kind of love I ever got. Yeah.
Yeah.
He was a character.
Yeah.
Yeah,
okay. And
he very much wanted to impress upon us. You sort of got the sense that he had come from a difficult background, right? And had found a sense of family in the Marine Corps that he hadn't elsewhere. And it was, tough love, of course, right? He this is in the context of officer candidate school. So, they're putting you through hell on purpose and screwing with you in all variety of sometimes comical ways.
Especially you guys are going to be officers and he's a senior non-com. So
right. And he wanted to make sure that we understood the kinds of challenges that people who we might be responsible for might be going through, right? I mean, you have every sort of person in the military, right? Joining the military, it breaks you out of your bubble, right? Whatever that particular bubble is, you meet every kind of person in the military, which is one of the great things about it. And you're all bound together, by this common sort of, you're stamped with a common identity and this common purpose, and you have a sort of common intense experiences because you all go through the same sort of training and are gearing up to the same conflicts. And, for him, like love was an important part of it. Tough love, but love nonetheless.
Right. There's another kind of love, and that comes through, and it reminded me of the story of Chaplain McLaughlin, and yes. You have in one of your short stories in Deployment about a chaplain, and I don't remember if it was an echo there, but anyway, you tell us the story about Chaplain McLaughlin and the fatally wounded Iraqi children. What was that story, Phil?
Sure. So war in urban areas means civilian casualties. It means injured men, women, and children, right? First month of my deployment, suicide truck bomb outside our main gate. We're carrying stretchers. At one point, I'm carrying a stretcher with, just like a little kid with injuries like I've never seen on an adult before. Just the kind of horrible things that bombs do to human bodies. And so military triage is a kind of cold process, right? It's like, if you can't help somebody, you make them comfortable, and then you go and you work on, the people that you can help, because you've got dozens and dozens of severely injured people. I mean, the doctors that night were, taking out pieces of intestine that have been riddled by shrapnel and sewing. I mean, it's just unreal, what the kind of work that they're doing. Mm-hmm. Very rapidly. But you never want to just leave somebody to die in a corner, especially if that person is a child. And so Chaps McLaughlin took it upon himself to hold those kids as they died. And eventually the corpsmen made rocking chairs for him. They called them combat rocking chairs. And I think it was that he rocked 11 children to death in those chairs.
Right. And I think, did he destroy them when he left his post, or am I?
Before he left for Iraq, he, did a bonfire and he burned the chairs. Right.
Yeah. And there's something else now I was flipping it. I mean, that is the real severe story. And then, but you offer some practical advice in this book, and I thought it was fascinating. He said, people will come up to you and say, my husband doesn't want to talk about it, my brother or my father, whatever the relative. What do you advise? What do you advise relatives or loved or spouses of veterans to get them to, quote, open up or at least connect? What's your advice, Phil?
Yeah, well, so this is in the context of, and this is from the same essay where I talk about Chaps McLaughlin and about sort of the moral and spiritual things that he was grappling with as this was happening.
Yeah.
And also sort of my own kind of reflections on participation in a place where, in a war where that's going on. And at one point I'd mentioned a woman who come up to me, and I think it was her boyfriend or her husband had served overseas, and she knew that something bad had happened, right? But he wouldn't open up about it. And she wanted to know how to talk to him about it. And my advice was to ask him first about the good things in his deployment, the people he loved, why he went in, get the context that actually provides meaning, right? Because a sort of shocking and horrible story without that context is just a shocking and horrible story, right? It's just kitsch. Whereas it's the connections between people and the love between people and the richness of life that is destroyed in war, right? You need to understand that richness of life first for any of the bad things to have any kind of meaning, right? That we're not, trauma is not the thing that defines human beings so much as what is around that trauma.
Right. Well, that's good. One of the powerful theme in this book is not just all combat stories or this, and your title is Uncertain Ground, is Citizenship in an Endless Invisible War. And a theme one of the themes that I write and talk about is community. So there is a community in the military. So when you come back from military or combat service, finding that community can be very challenging. Am I correct, Phil? So,
yeah, for sure. I think, in some ways this is like anything, right? You leave college and go off on your own, whatever it is, just there's always that sort of stage of finding new people, finding new community, which can be challenging. And so, and of course, this kind of, when you've served at war, the kind of disjunction is even more apparent. But I think one of the other things that makes coming home from a war zone so strange is that there is a connection, right, between what we do here and what is done overseas, right? You're overseas, you have an American flag on your shoulder. Everything that you're doing is a result of political decisions made here in America. And yet when you come home, it seems like there's very little public sense that we're at war. That was true even when I came home, when there was a much more lively debate. And it's certainly true now when we remain sort of killing people in a wide variety of countries, actually. But there's almost no political debate about it.
Right.
And so one of the things that was important to me was to try to do what I could, and this is a continuing theme of my work, to connect those two worlds, right? And to make the connections more apparent, and to make a style of warfare which we wage now, which is designed to be illegible to the average civilian, right? Hard to understand, hard to wrap your hands around, right? And to try and communicate not only what we're doing, but also the ways in which we could change the structure of how we wage war so that it was more firmly under democratic, subject to democratic control and accountability.
Right. And so toward that, there was something that you write, you tell the story of Major Fishback, who was I believe in the Anbar province with you, who made a decision not to pursue a raid after two Marines, he had lost two Marines. And you write this very eloquently. So once you move outside,
Fishback was a special forces guy. Yeah.
Special forces. Okay. You write, once you move, and I think that gets to where we are now in our own world, is at least I interpret it. You write, once you move outside the realm of physical force into the realm of social power, you move into the realm of uncertainty. Yes. So what did that mean then, and what does it mean now?
Right. So Fishback was on a sort of fault line between Kurds and Sunnis, and there's a lot of bad blood, right? And he was trying to hold the peace. And this strike that had killed two soldiers for obvious reasons, threatened to blow all that up. And he had a sense of which tribe was responsible. And he could have responded very aggressively, right? And no one would have, had any issue with him making that choice. But he also felt, and the piece gets a little bit more into the complexities of the decision. He felt that there was a way that he could essentially negotiate with the most important sheikh, and do things that would maintain the peace. And that is ultimately what happened. He went with essentially, like diplomacy and political deal making rather than violence. And on the one hand, if he had gone with violence, he could have found people who might not have been directly responsible, but the sheikh probably had blood on his hands at some point. It would have felt good. He could have racked up what would have felt like a definite win, right? Mm-hmm. Like you've done something definitive, killed people or taken people out or whatever. And then on the other hand, you have this sort of nebulous political agreement. And who knows what the long-term effects of that are going to be. What he knew was that this was an extremely fragile situation that could have easily exploded into widespread violence. And so he went with the political solution, not knowing how it would turn out, whether it would be a good thing in the end. It seems like it worked out in the end, and sort of the betterment for everybody there, including the American forces, right?
Right.
But oftentimes, I think what we have developed, right, in America, we've developed a highly sophisticated apparatus for targeting and killing people, right? The American system of targeted killing is like nothing the world has ever seen before. And I go into the development of that a little bit in the book as well. And so we're very good at finding and killing people. That's sort of what's happening on the ground after we kill people, right? What are the second, third order consequences of violence? What is this happening to political and cultural and social changes in the region that are ultimately going to be far more determinative in terms of whether this region remains violent, what's likely to happen in the long term, whether we even achieve our own ends. Those things are sort of difficult, and so we often are less interested in them. And I think that's a very dangerous situation for us to be in, right? And I think that we often substitute an easy problem, which is, can I kill this guy, with a hard problem, which is, can I operate in this region in a way that will in the long term lead to a more stable settlement that is in everybody's interest?
As you're saying that, I couldn't help but think of the image, and and that story is a good one. And we all want to revere diplomacy, but it's the harder path. But I'm also thinking about, the hundreds of thousands of men and women like yourself who were put into combat. You're all volunteers, of course. And what are the after effects of you? And I think this book on you, and your book, both in your fiction and your nonfiction, wrestles with those consequences. Is that part of the invisible war, Phil? So,
I think there's a variety of things that veterans feel, and it's sort of difficult to extrapolate about veterans as a group because it's such a wide and diverse group, But, just to give you an example, we pulled troops out of Afghanistan. There are a lot of people who worked with Americans who are either still over in Afghanistan or their families are still over there. And there's a large network of veterans and religious groups and humanitarian groups that have been trying to work visas, get people over to the States. And that process has been pretty rough, right? And frankly, the administration has not been particularly good on it. And so I think there's a deep sense of betrayal, right? That in wars of the sort that we have waged, where a lot was asked of a very small number of people, we haven't even lived up to the promises that we made to those who helped us, right? And I think that it's a situation where there's a limited number of people who have a stake in this, and it leads to not only sort of inconsistent or incoherent or poorly thought out and unaccountable military policy, but also an unwillingness to deal with the sort of after effects of that in a serious way.
Right. It's a challenge for our times. And as we go forward, I want to touch on, this is just my little question here. You write both nonfiction and you write fiction, and both eloquently. When you write nonfiction, do you ever say, boy, I wish I could just make it up? And when you write fiction, do you wish the story were already told?
You know, not really. It's a different thing, right? Mm-hmm. So when you're writing nonfiction, you're sort of you're trying to bring the reader into an argument that you're having, and the materials of that are the materials of real life. Whereas when you're writing fiction, you're trying to immerse them in an experience that you're creating for them. And so it's not. I mean, you know, my fiction does draw very much. I mean, I do research like a journalist would, you know, to write my fiction. But it's. No, they don't cross over in those ways.
Okay. Well, one thing I do exist. You're a writer that I admire, and it's a craft that I pursue myself. But so often, especially in redeployment, when I could only read 2 or 3 short stories at a time. It was so immersive, and it drains me as a reader, but it's well worth it, folks. Do plunge into it. But do you feel exhausted when you write these kinds of powerful stories that get to the heart and soul of who we are as humans? Does it take it out of you too, Phil? So, yeah.
I think that the writing can be difficult for sure. I mean, I'm glad that I'm doing it. But yeah, some of the stories put me in a rage when I'm writing about them. I mean, you're feeling the things that you're writing about. So yeah, you want to go into very deep places, and writing is a space of extreme vulnerability.
Great. And one thing now, we're coming to the close of our show here, and I ask every guest a story about grace. Phil, is there a story you wish to share with us? So,
of the experience of grace, I think
however you interpret it. So,
sure. I mean, I feel that most strongly with my children, I think, and I think that. There have been moments where I'm holding my kids, and I felt this at Mass, actually, where I feel not just sort of connected to my son in my arms by a bond of love, but as though we're sort of in a sea of love, right? That there's something much greater than ourselves, that we're not just physical beings, but are actually genuinely connected on a level that we catch glimpses of in moments that feel like intensely joyful.
That's great. And wonderful. Yes, children, they bring out the best in us. And I'm a grandfather now, so I know I have little ones. So I can relate to that connection there, but we're one step removed. So we can say goodbye.
Yeah.
So anyway, Phil, it's been such a pleasure. How can people find you?
On Twitter, my website's philklay.com. Pretty easy. Yeah.
Great. Well, we will put, and all your stuff's on Amazon and in all the major books chains and stuff. And Phil, it has been such an honor to have you on the show. And thank you for all you've done for us. And thank you for your eloquent writing.
Thank you.